Good evening. Thank you so much for attending the seminar of the U.S.-Taiwan relations as the Taiwan Relations Act turns 40, co-organized by the International Relations Council and my office. As Director Hughes just mentioned, today is a very special day. It marks the 40th anniversary of the enactment of the Taiwan Relations Act. This U.S. public law was approved on April the 10th, 1979, exactly 40 years ago. It built a very solid foundation for our bilateral relationships, and it also assures the continuation of our exchanges and cooperation right after the Carter administration shifted the diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to China in 1979. The Taiwan Relations Act also declares that peace and stability in that area are in the political, security, and economic interest of the United States, and makes very clear that the future of Taiwan will be determined by peaceful means. All these definite declarations are the cornerstones of the peace across the Taiwan Strait and the stable environment created by the Taiwan Relations Act provides my country with the perfect opportunity to develop our economy and evolve into a full-fledged democracy. Over the past 4 decades, the U.S.-Taiwan partnership has flourished and benefited the people in Taiwan, in the United States, and around the world. We are the 11th largest trading partner of the United States and the 7th largest buyer of American high-quality agricultural commodities. Every year, we import a good amount of wheat, soybean, and corn from the U.S. Midwest. In addition, Taiwan plays a very important role in the supply chain of electronic products. Actually, that your iPhones are designed by Apple, but made in China by a Taiwanese company. And many American high-tech enterprises like Amazon, Google, and Facebook have already established their Asian R&D centers in my country. Besides, probably you are not aware, Garment International, which created more than 25,000 jobs in this area, was co-founded by an American Mr. Gary Burrell and the Taiwanese Min Kao. And that is the reason why this company is called Garment. Besides this close economic and trade relationships, we also enjoy very close bilateral relationships, and we do have strong bipartisan support, not just at federal level, but also at states level. Now I'm very pleased to share with you some concrete developments between our two countries during the past year. For instance, a series of bills supporting Taiwan have been passed by both the U.S. Senate and House of Representatives, and all of them has been signed into laws. One of these is the Taiwan Travel Act, which encourages the exchange of visits between high-level officials from our two sides. U.S. Ambassador at Large for Religious Freedom, Mr. Sam Brownback, the former governor of Kansas, was in my country last month, attending the first ever Regional Freedom Forum, co-organized by our two countries. And American Institute in Taiwan, your representative mission to my country, recently completed the construction of its own office compound in our capital city of Taipei, which serves as a very powerful symbol of our enduring partnership. In addition, the Trump administration announced the arms sale to Taiwan once again last fall, so as to reinforce our self-defensive capabilities. Furthermore, Taiwan is highly praised for its mature democracy and a close partnership with the United States. Not long ago, US Vice President Mike Pence lauded Taiwan in public by saying that America will always believe that Taiwan's embrace of democracy shows a better path for all the Chinese people. And US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo also committed Taiwan as a reliable partner and a force for good in the region. All these encouraging signs shows that our bilateral ties are closer than ever before. There's no better time for us to further promote this special bond on the existing solid foundation. While we celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Taiwan Relations Act, we are always very grateful for America's strong and consistent support and your genuine friendship. As a responsible stakeholder in the Indo-Pacific, my country will continue cooperating very closely with all like-minded countries in the region to safeguard freedom and democracy, as well as to make substantial contributions. In conclusion, I wish to quote the remarks recently made by US Department of State. The United States has been, is, and will always be Taiwan's closest friend and partner. So I would like to say thank you, the United States of America.
My own background is very much as a China scholar, and I use the word China broadly, Greater China. I have family ties to Hong Kong. My most recent visit to Taiwan was last summer, a year ago summer, I guess, with the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, which was a really fascinating experience and an opportunity to get a kind of close-hand look at both the political situation in Taiwan, some of the economic and business issues, and just to really experience the warm hospitality of the people of Taiwan. And I'm sure many of you in the audience that may have had that experience probably understand what I'm talking about. So this is a really great opportunity. So my task from Matthew is a little bit different today, though. I'm supposed to present as a law professor and introduce a little bit about the text and background of the TRA, and I hope to also shed a little bit of light on this kind of interesting triangle that the U.S. finds itself in U.S.-China relations, given that it is such a long-standing friend and ally of Taiwan. And so that relationship has become quite complex, and perhaps more complex than even at the time of the TRA, which was already a very interesting time, as I hope you'll see. So some of this I may overlap with other speakers here, but I thought I'd start by just quoting, if you go to the Department of State's website, you'll see kind of its statement of the relationship with Taiwan, which confirms the U.S. and Taiwan enjoy a robust unofficial relationship. The 1979 Taiwan Relations Act provides the legal basis for that unofficial relationship. So we can see that even today, the TRA, after 40 years, is really kind of the core and the foundation of our relationship with Taiwan. So what is the TRA? This is the top of the text of it. We're looking right at the law itself. You can see the date there, April 10th, 1979. And right from the start, we see again its purpose is to help maintain peace, security, and stability in the Western Pacific and authorize the continuation, because by this time, again, the U.S. had only just transitioned diplomatic recognition from the mainland from Taiwan to the mainland, continuation of commercial, cultural, and other relations between the people of the United States, the people of Taiwan. So that's kind of the background objectives of the TRA. So I won't bore you with putting the entire details up here, but just a little bit of a framework of the key elements of the TRA, with apologies to Director General Chang. Perhaps there's other elements he'd like to highlight, but we can talk in the Q&A about that. The first is military, and here is the most central text from that section, Section 3, which states that the U.S. will make available to Taiwan defense articles and defense services, the emphasis being on military aid for defensive purposes. The second big element is a continuation of international pre-1979 commitments, because Taiwan, again, enjoyed diplomatic recognition for many years, And there was a strong interest, as we'll see, in ensuring that Taiwan retained its status in the international stage, its ability to participate in international organizations, notwithstanding the transition to kind of an unofficial status and the transfer of our recognition to the People's Republic of China. Coordination, you heard mention of the American Institute in Taiwan. That is our representative office in Taiwan. It is the counterpart of TECO, our TECRO here in the US. And the language of the TRA mentions and describes both of those offices in great detail and their role as an unofficial representative. So it's kind of a quasi-diplomatic status that each of those offices enjoy. And then the last key element of this is congressional oversight, and I'll say more about why that matters in a moment. But that's kind of the basic framework of the TRA. Before I get into a little bit of the backdrop of the history of kind of what led the US to adopt the TRA, I really found this quote really helpful. It comes from one of the best scholars I've read recently on the history of the TRA and of China and Taiwan, Stephen Goldstein. And this is a fairly recent book, but this is kind of the quote that appears in the front cover of it. And I thought it was really amazing, so I share it with you. It happens to be from Marx. It's an essay he wrote about Napoleon Bonaparte. He says, "Men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They don't make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already, given and transmitted from the past." And I have an opportunity to teach Chinese law at KU, and I find that our students, many of them have traveled widely, but not many of us have opportunity to spend a lot of time learning much at all about the history of this region, and it's quite fascinating. So if you'll bear with me, I'd like to kind of take us back in time to the circumstances that led to the establishment of the TRA and really laid the groundwork for where we are today. Okay, so back to 1683. This is when the Chang Empire absorbed Taiwan. Taiwan had previously been kind of a stopping off point for pirates and Japanese and the Dutch and a lot of other folks. In 1895, the Chang dynasty was defeated by the Japanese in the Sino-Japanese War, and Taiwan was ceded to Japan and became a Japanese colony for around 50 years. Okay, the Chang flag is on the left, the Japanese flag in the middle, and on the right is the very first flag of the Republic of China. In 1912, it was founded on the mainland after the fall of the Chang dynasty. The next big step in Taiwan's history is really the aftermath of World War II, and this is an era where kind of great powers were deciding many things. As you can see, Japan agreed to return Taiwan. It was unclear in the original declaration to whom Taiwan was being returned. Okay, but when Japanese surrendered, the Allies put Taiwan under the Republic of China's control in 1945. In 1947, the Kuomintang government, that's the nationalist government in Taiwan, imposed martial law. 1949 was the founding of the People's Republic of China, and the KMT, the nationalist army that remained in the mainland, then fled to Taiwan and became kind of the founding dynasty of the government in Taiwan. In 1951, there was a peace treaty, again, kind of the wrap-up of World War II, where Japan renounced its right to Taiwan. The Allies accepted that renunciation, but there was really no Chinese participation at all. No one from the Republic of China, no one from the PRC, no Chinese representation. It was kind of all decided by everybody else. Very interesting. The key principals in Taiwan at that point, Chiang Kai-shek or Jiang Jieshi, president from 1943 to 1975. I think the dates are kind of interesting. They're equally long. They start right around the same time and end right around the same time. And of course, Chairman Mao on the PRC side from 1943 to 1976. The other piece of this puzzle that might be helpful is to understand what's the mainland's position on Taiwan, because I think that that very much affects where the US sits in the US-Taiwan relationship. And interestingly enough, these kind of core positions I have drawn from the various kind of documents that form the basis of kind of US and mainland understandings, but they really haven't changed a lot. These positions on the mainland side have really not changed much at all since 1949. The first is that there's one China and that Taiwan is part of China, that China's territorial sovereignty is the foundation of US and mainland relations. The status of Taiwan is a domestic issue in which the US should not interfere. The US's intervention and military support is the main obstacle to the reunification of Taiwan with the mainland, and China has not yet renounced the potential use of force to retake Taiwan. So that's kind of the context in which we sit. So kind of the run-up to the US's recognition of the government of the PRC diplomatically begins kind of right around this time. So this is a bit of a summary of kind of pre-1971, which is where we'll pick up with the US conversation. As many of you may know, the US began its kind of relationship with Taiwan in supporting the nationalist government, the KMT, during the Chinese Civil War. And then that transitioned into a recognition of the Republic of China as the government of China. 1950, the Korean War begins, and that's important because that was kind of the run-up or the context in which, in 1954, the US and Taiwan signed a mutual defense treaty. It followed a skirmish between the mainland and Taiwan, and that lasted all the way until the period we'll be talking about with the TRA. Between the 1950s and 1979, there were over 200 attempted negotiations between the US and the PRC over the status of Taiwan. All of them failed, okay? And in 1971, we have the PRC being admitted to the United Nations, where it took the seat that had been held by the Republic of China. So that's kind of the first step in this kind of transition that the US ultimately pursued. That road began by a visit secretly between National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger to the mainland to meet with Premier Zhou Enlai in 1971. That's July. That preceded talks in February between Nixon and Mao and other leaders, Zhou Enlai as well. The top is Mao, the bottom is Zhou Enlai. From the beginning of Kissinger's visit, interestingly enough, to the mainland, he had actually hoped, it's told, to avoid the Taiwan question because of the complexity of it. But the PRC side really brought it kind of front and center from the very first meeting. So it was something they were extremely concerned about and really kind of set up a choice for the US. It's kind of either us or them in terms of diplomatic recognition. Meanwhile, we were still recognizing Taiwan, the Republic of China, as the government of China. Okay. This is the 1972 position that was agreed on by both sides during Nixon's visit, that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain that there is one China and that Taiwan is a part of China. The United States does not challenge that position. Note what we're not saying. We don't say whether we agree with it or not. We just agree that that's the understanding that everyone has, okay? President Carter and Deng Xiaoping were the principals involved in the next step of the process, which is the transition to normalization of relations with the PRC. The picture in the middle is National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski, who served during the Carter administration and was very instrumental in bringing about this kind of rapprochement with China in an interest in containing the Soviet Union and having China on our side vis-a-vis the Soviet Union and kind of that relationship. Again, this is kind of Cold War era politics. I'm not the political scientist here. Dr. Pickering may have more to share, but these are the principles involved. This led to the 1978 communique. So the US and PRC relationship rests on 3 communiques. This is the second one. The first one was the Shanghai one. This is the second one. Again, entered into between Carter and Deng Xiaoping. The US recognizes the PRC as the sole legal government of China, and the government of the United States of America acknowledges the Chinese position that there is but one China and Taiwan is part of China. So this is the document that allowed the PRC to feel comfortable with accepting the US kind of overtures and interest in reaching agreement and switching our diplomatic recognition over to the PRC. There were some conditions to that. The first one was that US troops be removed from Taiwan, that the mutual defense treaty we talked about a minute ago would be ended, and it was Deng Xiaoping's clear expectation that at the end of that treaty, all military forces would in fact be removed from Taiwan, and in addition, arms sales would stop. We actually didn't really agree to that, and it became clear at the 11th hour that we really weren't going to have a meeting of the minds on that point, so the story is that Deng relented because it was so close to normalization. And that was a kind of sacrifice he was willing to make temporarily, again, with the hopes that some of those unofficial commitments might be honored and arms sales would stop fairly soon. The switch of diplomatic recognition. So in 1979, with this foundation, we had the 1979 Joint Communique. This is the third one that established, again, the foundation for US and PRC normalization and relations. Okay. And a month later, Deng Xiaoping appears in Washington, makes a visit to Texas where he gets a cowboy hat, and has some meetings with Carter at the White House as well, again, to celebrate this change in status of the PRC. Interestingly enough, Congress, at almost the exact moment of Deng's visit, begins drafting the TRA. Okay, and the reason was because it turns out neither Congress nor Taiwanese officials were at all consulted or warned that we would be shifting diplomatic recognition to the PRC. Everyone sort of found out about it kind of at actually the 11th hour. I think the Taiwanese representative heard about it at 2 o'clock in the morning before it was announced to the nation. So that's not a fun way to find out that you've kind of had the rug pulled out from under you. Congress was not happy. Okay, so Congress had a number of different, and Congress is not one thing, obviously. We have a lot of different representatives, a lot of different views. This is kind of a summary of some of the primary concerns that they had, realizing what Nixon had agreed to. First of all, they needed something to replace the Mutual Defense Treaty to reassure Taiwan that even though this massive change had happened, peace and security would still be assured. There's obviously an interest in maintaining economic ties with the PRC. We have a number of very important trade arrangements, for example, that have all laid a foundation for all the many wonderful things you saw on the video a moment ago. Clearly worries about what it would look like if the US were seen as just overnight abandoning an ally. Vietnam was not that long ago. What about if Taiwan felt friendless, it might kind of go toward the Soviet Union. Some people worried about that. It was also unclear how long Deng Xiaoping would actually be the person who had the power to say what the relationship should look like on the mainland side. He had been purged before. Concerns clearly about the use of force against Taiwan by the PRC mainland. You can see that as kind of a theme throughout here. There were also some concerns expressed over human rights in Taiwan, which at this time was under martial law. There were some questions about the status of Taiwan under international law, kind of legal questions. There's a handful of representatives that also supported independence and thought maybe this was the time to consider that. By this time, the US was in fact one of the few kind of larger trading partners of Taiwan and kind of developed countries that had not already switched over diplomatic recognition to China. So there was kind of a precedent for what unofficial relations would look like post this transition. There was also a lawsuit pending through the courts by this time about the constitutionality of the fact that President Carter had basically unilaterally gotten rid of the Mutual Defense Treaty. Can a president do that? It seems to be the reverse of entering into a treaty, which actually requires Congress. He didn't really bother to get Congress's approval. Congress is obviously unhappy about that. The US Supreme Court dismissed it without deciding on the merits. So that question was also kind of brewing at this time. So again, this is kind of a summary of the key elements of the TRA that kind of came out of the mix, again, by April. So to us, a very fast period of time for something so significant. We have 3 months of work, and we end up with the document that really reinforces the friendship and the longstanding ties with Taiwan, the importance of Taiwan to peace and stability in the region, the importance to the United States of maintaining strong economic and cultural ties, the commitment, I should use that in quotes because there's debate over how much of a commitment it was, but an intention to provide Taiwan with defensive military capabilities, as well as a clear statement that the US intended to resist any effort to force Taiwan to return to the mainland and be reunified through military means. Also, a nod to those who were concerned about the fact that Taiwan was at this time not democratic and not an exemplar of human rights. A statement that nothing in this act will prevent the United States from speaking out about those issues on the human rights front. Oops. So again, here we are with the key elements of the TRA as it evolved and came to be. And I will conclude by highlighting some of the tensions that this document embodied, which I think, if we're watching the news, and I think as we'll hear later on this evening, tend to percolate through today because of this odd triangular sort of relationship with the US having diplomatic ties with the PRC. The PRC is obviously a very important trading partner and economic partner, as well as, in some sense, perhaps a competitor of the US. And we also have Taiwan in the middle of all of that, and again, one of our strongest trading partners and a longstanding ally and friend. The tensions are these, I think, primarily. First of all, the PRC's position is extremely is founded quite strongly on this notion of territorial sovereignty. It is kind of a red line, if you will, in US mainland relations, at least in the view of the PRC. That's kind of the backdrop of this, is normalization with the PRC. On the other hand, we have clear commitments in the TRA to maintain military support and aid to Taiwan. The second point is that there's a recognition in the underlying documents that the future of Taiwan, and this is the US position today, the future of Taiwan should be determined by peaceful means and by the parties themselves, meaning on both sides of the Taiwan Strait, Taiwan on the one hand and the mainland on the other. At the same time, we are safeguarding Taiwan's defensive capability, which kind of puts us in the middle somehow in kind of an awkward way. Number three, we've committed to maintain the international status that Taiwan had prior to 1979, and I was very struck in reading the TRA in preparation for this at how much pains and effort were gone to kind of describe something that looked just like any other diplomatic relationship but kind of wasn't. A lot of effort to do that, to maintain those ties and make sure that the economic and cultural exchange continues. At the same time, we're calling it unofficial relations with no diplomatic recognition. And lastly, at the time of the TRA, this is less important maybe today, is that there was a sense that we are supporting Taiwan as a democracy, as an offset to communist China. Again, that piece of the dynamic is the same, but at the same time, at this time, in 1979, Taiwan was not a democracy. Okay, so this argument makes a little bit more sense maybe to us today, particularly from the US standpoint. At that time, it was controversial because Taiwan was under martial law until 1981, a couple more years after this, and did not hold its first democratic elections until 1995 and 1996. So here's where we are today. This is, again, the full text of most of what's on the US State Department website about Taiwan. We enjoy a robust unofficial relationship. We do not support Taiwan independence, but we maintain strong unofficial relations with Taiwan to further peace and stability. And the 1979 Taiwan Relations Act is the foundation of all of that.
I am very honored to be here tonight on the 40th anniversary of the Taiwan Relations Act. It really is a tremendous privilege. I will say that my words tonight will be different than Professor Harper Ho's. I've been given a different task, so my talk will be perhaps a little bit shorter. I'm not sure. We'll see how these things go. But I've been asked to talk about two recent trips that I took to Taiwan and my reflections on those. So mine will be a little bit less historical and more, I almost want to say emotional. So I'm not, a little background about myself, I am not an expert on Chinese politics, Taiwanese politics, in any shape or form. I'm an international relations scholar. Much of my work is sitting in a computer in my office or at my home. I do quantitative work. I have a big data set that the NSF funded on military interventions and how countries use force across borders. I do not have a regional focus. I'm working on a book right now on military intervention into Africa for Cambridge Press, but I do not have a deep regional focus. So what all that means is I'm a very interested observer, but I'm not an expert. But I did have the great fortune to go on 2 trips to Taiwan, roughly a decade apart. They were sponsored by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Taiwan, and they gave me a wonderful glimpse into the political climate, the context, and a little bit of the depth of what we're talking about tonight. First, and the main thing I'll talk about tonight is the changing climate between these 2 periods. The first trip was in 2009. The second trip was last year in 2018. And the political climate could not be different. There couldn't be a more stark contrast between the 2 periods. And it's very important for the Republic of China right now. A little bit about the trips. The trips were wonderful opportunities, great learning experiences, and they were a testament to the really tight, long-standing relationship between our 2 countries, the warm friendship between our 2 countries. On each trip, about a dozen, maybe a baker's dozen, academics were brought together, brought to Taiwan, and we were given a unique window into many of the political situations, the context of the country at that time. We met with leading ministers. This last trip, we met with the foreign minister. We met with leaders of the key political parties. We met with senior military leadership. We met with university professors. We met with the Taiwan Institute for Democracy. We met with a range of different entities. Really wonderful access within Taiwan. In one of the trips this last time, we went to an Air Force base, and I got to try a flight simulator for the very first time, and I learned that not only would I not be a good pilot because of my poor eyesight, there are many other reasons I wouldn't be a good pilot, including my equilibrium. But these trips really provided a wonderful opportunity to get different angles, different perspectives on the political context in the country. Before I get to the different political climates, there was one visit on this trip, a day visit, that really hit home for me, really drove the point home of what we're talking about. And that was a visit to the island of Kemen. I didn't remember the name of the island of Kemen. It was a quick trip. It was a busy summer. I didn't do the research I should have before I went. But you might remember Kemen from the anglicized name that I remember it from my high school textbooks, from my college textbooks, and that's Quemoy. Quemoy was at the center of one of the disputes Dr. Harper Ho was talking about just a moment ago that really could have changed Cold War history, could have changed the history of the world. And being able to visit that island was a remarkable opportunity. I don't know if you remember this. The visit brought, well, because we visited historical sites, it brought back memory of these things I'd studied long ago. There were two intense crises over Quemoy in 1954 and 1958. And I'm going to get to the reason why I'm talking about Kemen in a second. The first one in 54 was so intense that Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai, who we saw a picture of a moment ago, said that the PLA must, publicly stated this, must liberate Quemoy and Matsu. Eventually, John Foster Dulles, the U.S. Secretary of State, threatened publicly that the United States would use nuclear weapons, or would consider using nuclear weapons in response. And at that time, again, this is all getting to the visceral images that I'm going to show you, and the reason why this is such an important topic today. At that time, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff recommended to Eisenhower that nuclear weapons be used on the mainland in response to the nonstop shelling of Quemoy. Eisenhower said no. What that sparked, as I was thinking about this talk tonight, that sparked in my mind was that very same year, and actually I hadn't put them together until yesterday, that very same year, military advisors also advised Eisenhower to use nuclear weapons at Dien Bien Phu, 1954, when the Vietnamese had surrounded the French and the French were about to surrender in that former colony. 2 times in that same year, military advisors urged, I'm from K-State, so I can say this, I know that we're on the border. I'm originally from Missouri, so from St. Louis, but our Kansas president said no. His quote after Dien Bien Phu was something along the lines of, my God, boys, we can't use these horrible weapons in the same region within the span of a decade. And my thinking about this, with urgent military advice to use these weapons, the fact that Eisenhower stood strong really changed the course. I would argue there are many things that changed the course of history, but this did. If nuclear weapons were used again, even in a limited way, within a decade of 1945, Cold War history might be very different. The 1958 crisis was no less fraught, and it wasn't until the United States sent the 7th Fleet and the PLA ran out of shells that the shelling stopped. In 44 days, 500,000 shells landed on Quemoy. And the reason I'm talking about this side trip is what really brought this home to me is visiting Quemoy and seeing to this day, and I'm not sure why, I've seen these pictures before, I've traveled some, but seeing the landing barricades still in place to this day along the beaches somehow had a strong impact on me about what we're talking about the precarious situation. Over the long term, we're talking about a question of existential threat to the Republic of China. And these images, as I stared across the beach, were very powerful for me. Before I get to the two different periods, I want to go to another episode from Kimin that I think highlights more, again, what we're talking about. We were taken to a very fascinating little factory on Kimin with an entrepreneur, a man named Maestro Wu, who takes some of these shells, and by the way, the PLA continued to shell Quemoy until 1979, but they didn't use live ammunition. They used shells filled with propaganda. So you have hundreds of thousands of shells on this island. Maestro Wu takes these and makes world-class knives for kitchenware, for swords, anything. So this, to me, again, underscored what we're talking about. We're talking about a vibrant, entrepreneurial, capitalist, democratic country with a tremendous spirit and a very warm environment when you visit. So the two periods. When I went in 2009, and again, I'm not a Taiwanese expert, I'm not a China expert. I was surrounded by them during this first trip, though. When I went in 2009, President Ma had just been elected the year before. President Ma from the Pan-Blue Coalition, leader of the KMT, Kuomintang, Chiang Kai-shek's party. We saw Chang's picture a moment ago. And among all the academics I visited with at that time, there was a exuberance, a sense of hope, excitement. The academics I traveled with were very, very excited about Ma's new tenure in Taiwan. And the reason is Ma and the KMT initiated a series of sweeping policies to build stronger cross-strait relations with China. For the first time in 60 years, there were direct flights, which shaved about half the time off travel. You didn't have to go to Hong Kong or another third port of entry to fly between the countries. Now there are over 100 flights every week. Shipping, supposedly roughly over 100 million a year is saved in shipping costs because there can be direct shipping between the two countries and not reflagging and going to a different port. Tourism, for the first time mainland Chinese were allowed to come to Taiwan as tourists. Investment regulations were loosened, both for buying stocks in Taiwan, for investment in the mainland by Taiwanese businesses. It was a tremendous change and an openness. And this was KMT's, and we visited the KMT both times, and they were very staunchly supportive of this policy when we visited in last year in 2018. The KMC's policy, again, not an expert. My understanding of the KMC's policy is to build these cross-strait relations with the hope that that would create stability for the longer term, this engagement would allow for long-term peaceful relations between the two sides. President Ma became the first leader of Taiwan to meet with his Chinese counterpart, Xi, in Singapore in 2015. So this was an era, a time of hope, a time of excitement. Some of the academics I traveled with, quite frankly, were enthralled with Ma. One quote I heard was that he was the Taiwanese JFK. And people talked about the fact he's tall and handsome and charismatic too, so maybe that helped. Apparently a phenomenal speaker. The main opposition party throughout this time took a very different approach to cross-strait relations. The Pan-Green Coalition, led by the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party, and this is kind of interesting. If you step back and think about most countries, and you think about a more conservative party, a more liberal or labor party, and which might be hawks or which might be doves, the roles are somewhat switched in Taiwan. The DPP and the Pan-Green Coalition are a little bit more hawkish in terms of asserting autonomy or independence from China. And the Pan-Blue Coalition supports closer relations for the hope of stability in the future. I heard frequently during this last visit, especially from those associated with the Pan-Green Coalition, that Ma's policies were wrong, that it was a trap, that in the long term, well, the phrase Hong Kong, the name Hong Kong was used frequently, that eventually goodwill, positive relations, stronger ties, both accepting that there's one nation, would lead to a situation where freedoms are promised and then are slowly eroded if there is any type of reunification. So the Pan-Green Coalition opposed a lot of Ma's policies. There were protests throughout Ma's term in office. A lot of them, some notable ones were led by university professors and students with sit-ins, some of them somewhat violent with Molotov cocktails. So this is a snapshot of this first period. A period of what I felt, and again, this is my observations, I felt a period of optimism, a period of hope. Flash forward to last year and a visit in 2018. The KMT was no longer in power. The DPP, under President Tai, the first woman elected, the second DPP president in the history of Taiwan, took power. So why did Ma was term limited out, but why did the KMT, the Pan-Blue Coalition, lose the 2016 election? There are many answers to this. One is that the KMT had been in power for 8 years. There was some wariness, some throw the bums out kind of sentiment. The other, and some polling backs this up, is that some people were growing wary of Ma's policies. There was a growing unease. There was a sense that it was not working. Why was it not working? Because engagement, and step back and think about US policy towards the PRC. Engagement was not leading to a less aggressive foreign policy. Engagement was not leading to gradual democratization. According to those in the Pan-Green Coalition, it was leading to the opposite. Interesting story, and this is a side note, but when we visited the KMT and senior leaders and the DPP and key advisors, it was, to me, again, just an outside observer, almost a caricature of conservative and liberal parties. We visited the KMT in a very formal setting. There were elderly gentlemen sitting across the table from us, all in immaculate tailored suits, and everything was very formal. We visited the DPP, and two guys walked in late in jeans and t-shirts. One was a former university professor, a key advisor to Tai, and the other one was another senior advisor of some sort. Just almost a political cartoon of conservative as opposed to broadly liberal-based political parties. It was very interesting. So, if the KMT lost power because of unease with Mao's policies, what is the evidence, what is some evidence that his policies, that engagement was not working? Well, with regard to foreign policy, there's a lot of evidence, and I'll get into some recent events soon. But one example, which many of you probably already know about, is the Spratlys. Just a very visible example. Claimed by many different countries, including Brunei, Vietnam, and the PRC, even though it clearly violates the law of the sea, a border of 200 nautical miles for an exclusive economic zone. The PRC claims the entire South China Sea, based on historical precedent, as their sea. So the PRC is building islands and placing military installations on them, even though they decisively lost a UN Court of Arbitration ruling against the Philippines 2 years ago. It hasn't changed their policies one bit. They're very aggressive in terms of, they're aggressive in the Senkaku Islands or Daimyo Islands, with Japan as well. Their foreign policy does not seem to be moderated. In terms of the gradual evolution engagement was supposed to create towards democratization, again, I cannot claim I'm a Chinese scholar, an expert on Chinese affairs. But I traveled for 10 days with a bunch of Chinese experts. And one thing that came, oh no, Matthew, what do I do? One thing that came clear, sorry about that. Is that there seemed to be a consensus, which I was a little surprised about, among the American academics, that China was not democratizing in any shape or form. In fact, if anything, the opposite might be occurring. Spying on domestic population was increasing. Xi, of course, declared himself lifetime leader. But one example really hit home to me. One colleague really was forceful about this. It's a man named Joshua Eisenman. He's a professor at the LBJ School at UT Austin. He gave a very interesting podcast by the Carnegie Council where, and I think this is extreme, but he was strident throughout this visit, where he talked about fascism in China, that the authoritarianism was becoming so intense that control was seeping deeper and deeper into society. So one example that hit home for me, which I was surprised to hear, and this goes back to think of history and university students or university professors or the protests that we saw throughout Mao's period in Taiwan, party control of universities in China and of faculty is intensifying in subtle ways. Now there are political equivalents at the dean level or even lower levels in all Chinese universities. I had the opportunity last year, I think it was, to go to BITSU, the Beijing Institute of Science and Technology, but I wasn't able to go. I wish I had after I learned about all these, what I felt were dramatic changes and what was presented to me as dramatic changes. So you have a political officer in all the universities, kind of reminiscent, I think, back to my studies of the Soviet military, where there's a political officer and a chaplain at most ranks, most officer ranks. And more than that, if you think about academia and you think about academic freedom, it's about being a good teacher, doing research and publishing and sharing your knowledge. And that's how, in the not too distant past, Chinese scholars were rewarded within Chinese universities. According to Professor Eisenman and others, that system is almost completely gone. Now there are certain government grants that you must get that are tied to party control, and those are central to all advancement within the university system. This all goes back to the universities are hotbeds of protest. We've seen this in the past in Chinese history, and they're clamping down on autonomy within the universities. So what about the political climate now? The political climate couldn't be more different in 2018 from 2009. A lot of the meetings I went in, there was anxiety and tension. Sometimes it was almost dripping in the room, dripping from some of the speakers. And the reason is China is exerting much, much more pressure on Taiwan since the 2016 election, even before the 2016 election. Before the 2016 election, to try to influence and demonstrate what would happen if the DPP, which more strongly supports vocal independence, gained power. But there are all sorts of examples of this tightening of the screws. And the tensions are ramping up. Good example is that we were told that cyber attacks on Taiwanese government institutions were rampant and were intense and were hard to protect against. We were told there was harassment of shipping and air and planes. We know that China is aggressively trying to poach diplomatic partners of Taiwan as part of a diplomatic game and to demonstrate that there's no legitimacy to Taiwanese independence. So Panama, Dominican Republic, a small African republic, in the past 2 years all switched sides, switched allegiances to the PRC. Taiwan now only has 16 countries that recognize it as a sovereign independent country. Most of those are islands in the Pacific or in the Caribbean, except for Swaziland in Africa. And the king of Swaziland has a nice quote, I won't remember it exactly, but he says why he won't switch, he will not switch. Why would you sit at a feast with 150 people when you can have a feast with only 15 others? So you'll get a lot more feast. The East Asian Youth Games. China put pressure on regional countries to overturn a decision to allow Taiwan to host the East Asian Youth Games, all because of a dispute about Olympic Games between the two countries. Even more, At the end of last month, for the first time in 20 years, two Chinese fighter planes broke the median line in the Taiwan Strait, and that led to a 10-minute confrontation with Taiwanese planes. This type of pressure has been intensifying. So what does this mean for the long term? What does the future hold? I'm not sure. I'm not sure that experts on Taiwan or China are sure, but as China's economic and military clout grows, that makes the situation, I would argue, more perilous, and it makes the Taiwan Relations Act that much more important. Again, going back to Master Wu, vibrant, democratic, open, entrepreneurial society facing increasing pressure. So these are just impressions from two different periods, two very different political climates, and an experiment in 2009 that didn't work out as well as perhaps one hoped. So thank you very much. We look forward to your questions.